Hello everyone, welcome to the course of Methodology of Foreign Language Teaching. Today we have the lecture number 2, Foreign Educational Paradigm of Education. A glance back in history reveals few, if any, research-based language teaching methods prior to the 20th century. In the Western world, foreign language learning in schools was synonymous with the learning to Latin or Greek. They were taught by means of classical method, focus on grammatical rules, memorization of vocabulary and of various declensions and conjugations, translation of texts, doing written exercises. The classical languages, first Greek then Latin, were used as a lingua francas. They were widely used in philosophy, religion, politics, and business. Major differences had developed between the classical Latin described in the Renaissance grammars and the Latin being used for everyday purposes. Latin began to be abundant as lingua franca. Various European vernaculars had begun to rise in prestige and utility. The most famous language teachers and methodologies of this period is Johann Amos Comenius, a Czech scholar and teacher who published a book about his teaching techniques between 1631 and 1658. Some of the techniques that Comenius used and exposed were the following. Use imitation instead of rules to teach a language. Have your students repeat after you. Use a limited vocabulary initially. Help your students practice reading and speaking. Teach language through pictures to make it meaningful. Thus, Comenius perhaps for the first time made explicit an inductive approach to learning a foreign language. His views held sway for some time, however, by the beginning of the 19th century, the analytical grammar translation approach became firmly entrenched as the method for teaching not only Latin, but by extension modern languages as well. It was codified in the word of Karl Pleutz, a German scholar who had a tremendous influence on the language teaching profession during his lifetime and afterwards. By the end of the 19th century, the direct method, which stressed the ability to use rather than to analyze a language as the goal of language instruction, had begun to function as a viable alternative to grammar translation. François Guinois, a Frenchman, an advocate of this method, advocated exclusive use of the target language in the classroom. He had been greatly influenced by the German philosopher-scientist Alexander von Humboldt, who had exposed the notion that the language cannot be taught. One can only create conditions for learning to take place. In 1886, the International Phonetic Association was established by scholars such as Henry Sweet, Wilhelm Beertze, and Paul Passy. They developed the International Phonetic Alphabet, which we call IPA, and became part of the reform movement in language teaching in the 1890s. These phoneticians advocated principles such as the following. The spoken form of a language is primary and should be taught first. The findings of phonetics should be applied to language teaching. Language teachers must have solid training in phonetics. Learners must have phonetic training to establish good speech habits. So this is the International Phonetic Alphabet, or otherwise we call it shortly the IPA. It is a universal alphabet representing all of the sounds that have been found in human language. The work of these phoneticians focused on the teaching of pronunciation and oral speech, which they felt had been ignored in grammar translation method. Quite apart from the work of the reform movement, the influence of the direct method grew. Émile de Souza, a disciple of Guinois, came to Cleveland, Ohio, in order to see to it that all foreign language instruction in the public school implemented the direct method. Later, the Modern Language Association of America, based on the Coleman Report, endorsed the reading approach to language teaching. The reading approach as reflected in the work of Michael West. Two others held sway in the US until the late 1930s and early 1940s, when World War II broke out and made it imperative for the US military to quickly and efficiently teach foreign language learners how to speak and understand a language. This is the end of the lecture. Thank you for your attention.